I think you should take a look at this.
What is this? It can't be.
At exactly 8:17 a.m., the courtroom doors swung open, and every single conversation inside died mid-sentence. The judge paused. The lawyers froze. Even the man standing at the center of it all, the husband who had spent months preparing to destroy his wife, felt something shift in his chest. Something he couldn't explain, because the woman who just walked in wasn't supposed to be here. Not today. Not ever again. She stepped forward slowly, heels clicking against polished marble like a countdown no one could stop. Her presence didn't beg for attention. It commanded it. And yet, what made the room suffocate wasn't just her entrance. It was her transformation. Gone was the quiet, overlooked woman they had all dismissed. Gone was the wife who sat silently beside her husband at charity galas, smiling politely while he spoke over her. Gone was the version of her they thought they understood. In her place stood someone else entirely, composed, unshaken, and terrifyingly certain. Her eyes didn't search the room. They locked directly onto him, her husband, the man who had filed to strip her of everything. The man who believed, by the end of today, she would walk out of this courtroom with nothing but humiliation. For the first time since this case began, he looked unsure. His fingers tightened against the edge of the table. A crack, small, but real, and she saw it. Oh, she saw it. A faint smile touched her lips, not out of joy, not out of relief, but because she knew something he didn't. Something no one in that room knew. Not yet, not even the judge. Because this wasn't just a divorce hearing. This was an execution, and he had just realized he might be the one on trial. Smash cut. 3 months earlier, at exactly 2:43 a.m., a black car sat parked across the street from her house. Engine off, lights off, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But someone was inside the house, behind drawn curtains. She stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. Her phone rested in her hand, screen dimmed, recording everything through a narrow gap in the blinds. The car hadn't moved for 17 minutes. Not a single inch, not a door opening, not a figure stepping out. Just presence. Silent, persistent, wrong. Her heart didn't race. That was the strange part. It had already gone beyond fear. Because this wasn't the first night, and it wouldn't be the last. She had noticed the pattern weeks ago. The same car, the same time, the same stillness. Whoever was inside wasn't careless. They were patient. And patience meant intention. Her grip tightened around the phone. She didn't call the police. She didn't wake anyone, because, deep down, she already knew. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. This was connected. Connected to the late-night calls her husband took outside. Connected to the sudden business trips that never quite added up. Connected to the way his tone changed when he thought she wasn't listening. And most of all, connected to the growing, suffocating realization that the life she was living was built on something she could no longer trust. Back inside the courtroom, that same woman now stood taller than anyone expected, stronger than anyone prepared for, and far more dangerous than anyone realized. Because while everyone believed today was the end of her story, it was actually the moment everything began to make sense. The car, the silence, the lies. Every piece had been leading here, to this room, to this moment, to this confrontation, and the truth? It wasn't just going to come out, it was going to explode. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever felt it? That quiet, uncomfortable feeling in your chest, when something just isn't right, not loud, not obvious, just off. The kind of feeling you try to ignore because you don't have proof. Because everything looks normal on the surface. Because questioning it would mean admitting something you're not ready to face. What would you do? If the person you trusted the most started becoming a stranger right in front of you, not overnight, not in a way anyone else could see, but in small, almost invisible ways, a delayed response, a forced smile, a conversation that ends just a little too quickly, what would you do? If every time you asked questions, you were made to feel like you were the problem, like you were overthinking, overreacting, imagining things that weren't there, because that's how it starts. Not with shouting, not with obvious betrayal, but with doubt, carefully placed, repeated, until you begin to question your own instincts, until your voice gets quieter, until your confidence shrinks just enough for someone else to take control. And the truth is, almost everyone has been there in one way or another, feeling unseen, feeling unheard, feeling like you're standing in a room where your presence doesn't carry weight. Maybe it wasn't a marriage. Maybe it was a relationship where your loyalty wasn't returned. Maybe it was a workplace where your effort was overlooked while someone else took the credit. Maybe it was a family situation where your voice never seemed to matter. Different stories, same feeling, that slow realization that you're giving everything and receiving less than you deserve. And here's the hardest part. When you finally begin to see it clearly, you don't always react immediately, because walking away isn't easy, because confronting the truth means changing everything, because sometimes you're still hoping you're wrong. She hoped she was wrong too. She told herself there had to be another explanation, that the late nights were just work, that the distance was just stress, that the silence was temporary. But deep down, she felt it, that quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't shout, but refuses to disappear. And the more she tried to ignore it, the louder it became, until one night, standing in the dark, watching that motionless car across the street, she stopped asking herself if something was wrong, and started asking a different question. How long had this been happening? Without her realizing it? Because here's something most people don't talk about. The moment you begin to question everything is the moment everything has already changed. And once that shift happens, you can't go back to who you were before. Now think about this. What if the person you underestimated the most was quietly paying attention to everything? Every detail, every inconsistency, every lie wrapped in a half-truth. What if the one person everyone believed had no power, was the only one who truly understood what was going on? Because in her world, she wasn't just a wife. Not really. She was treated like an accessory, a background presence, someone who existed but didn't influence anything. At public events, she stood beside him, beautiful, composed, and silent, while he controlled every conversation, every decision, every narrative. And people noticed, but they didn't question it, because power has a way of convincing others that what they're seeing is normal. A wealthy man, a quiet wife, a polished image. No one asked what she thought. No one asked what she knew. No one imagined that she might be watching everything more closely than anyone else in that room. And that's the mistake they all made. Because when someone is constantly overlooked, they don't become weak. They become observant. And observation is where power begins. Back in that courtroom, as she stood there, calm and unshaken, no one realized that this moment wasn't built overnight. It was built in silence, in patience, in the space where she was underestimated long enough to see everything clearly. And now, for the first time, she wasn't the one being questioned. She was the one holding the answers. Because here's the truth most people learn too late. Betrayal doesn't always arrive like a storm. It doesn't always break things instantly. It doesn't always expose itself in ways you can easily point to and say, there, that's the moment everything changed. Sometimes, it's quiet, careful, patient. It hides in routine, in familiar spaces, in everyday conversations that feel normal, until you replay them later and realize something didn't add up. It's in the way someone avoids your eyes for just a second too long, in the way their tone shifts when certain names come up, in the way their phone suddenly becomes something you're no longer allowed to see, not because they said it, but because you feel it. And that feeling, it doesn't go away. It waits. It grows. It sits with you in silence when the world around you looks perfectly fine. That's what makes it dangerous. Because while you're trying to protect the relationship, someone else might already be protecting a secret. And secrets, they don't stay small. They expand. They take up space. They force distance between people who once felt close, until one day, you wake up and realize you're not in the same relationship anymore. Even if everything still looks the same from the outside, that was her reality. From the outside, everything was flawless. A powerful man, a successful empire, a marriage that looked stable enough to impress anyone watching. But inside that house, something had shifted. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact became rare. Laughter, once natural, started to feel rehearsed. And the silence, that was the loudest part. Not the peaceful kind, not the comfortable kind. The kind that feels like something is being held back. The kind that makes you question whether you're imagining things or finally seeing them clearly. And when she tried to reach for him, emotionally, mentally, even just to understand what was changing, he pulled further away. Not aggressively, not obviously, just enough to make her feel like she was the one losing grip. That's how control works. Not by force, but by confusion, by shifting reality just enough that the other person begins to doubt themselves. And once doubt takes hold, it becomes easier to dismiss, easier to silence, easier to overlook, until the person experiencing it starts asking fewer questions, speaking less, feeling smaller. But here's where they miscalculated. She didn't stop noticing. She didn't stop thinking. She didn't stop connecting the pieces that didn't belong together. She simply stopped reacting. And that changed everything. Because when someone stops reacting, they start observing. And when observation replaces emotion, clarity begins to take control. She began to see patterns. The same late-night calls, the same unexplained absences, the same inconsistencies that didn't exist before. And then, the car, parked across the street, at the same hour, night after night. Not random, not accidental, intentional, and suddenly, everything she had been trying to ignore started aligning. This wasn't just distance. This wasn't just stress. This wasn't just a relationship going through a phase. This was something structured, something deliberate, something that involved more than just him. And once she understood that, fear wasn't her first response. Clarity was, because the moment you realize you've been lied to, you have two choices: break or pay attention. She chose to pay attention, and that decision was the beginning of his downfall. Back in the courtroom, as he watched her stand there, composed and unwavering, he still didn't understand the most important part. He thought this was about defending herself, about reacting, about trying to survive what he had set in motion. He was wrong. She wasn't reacting. She had been preparing for months, and now, the silence that once worked against her was about to work in her favor, because the truth he buried so carefully was no longer hidden. It was organized and ready long before the courtroom, before the silence in her marriage, before the car across the street. Naya had already been shaped into someone most people never truly understood, not because she was quiet, but because she didn't need to prove anything. Naya wasn't the type of woman who demanded attention when she entered a room. She didn't raise her voice to be heard. She didn't compete for space, and that's exactly why people underestimated her. They saw calm and mistook it for softness. They saw patience and assumed passivity. They saw restraint and believed she lacked power. What they didn't see was discipline, because Naya had been trained, mentally, emotionally, strategically, to process more than she revealed. Her background in military intelligence wasn't something she spoke about casually. In fact, most people in her social circle barely understood what it meant. They imagined paperwork, reports, routine structure. They were wrong. Her training was built on reading what wasn't being said, tracking patterns others ignored, understanding behavior before it turned into action. She learned how to sit in silence and gather more information than someone speaking for hours. She learned how to remain still while everything around her shifted. She learned how to recognize when something didn't align, even when there was no visible evidence yet. And most importantly, she learned patience, not the kind that waits helplessly, but the kind that watches, calculates, prepares. So when her marriage began to change, when Kyle's behavior started shifting in ways that didn't match his words, Naya didn't react immediately. She observed every late-night call, every unexplained absence, every inconsistency wrapped in a polished explanation. She noticed everything, even the things that seemed too small to matter, because in her world, small details were never random, and that's why, standing in that courtroom months later, she wasn't surprised. She was ready. But Naya wasn't shaped by training alone. Her strength didn't begin in military rooms or classified briefings. It began much earlier, in a home filled with presence, with voices, with stories that carried weight far beyond the words themselves. She grew up surrounded by people who didn't just teach her how to succeed. They taught her how to stand, not just physically, but internally. Her family didn't measure value by wealth alone. They measured it by integrity, by how you treated people when no one was watching, by whether your actions matched your words. And in that environment, Naya developed something rare, a deep, unshakable sense of self. She knew who she was long before she met Kyle, long before she stepped into his world of wealth and status, long before anyone tried to define her by proximity to someone else. That's what made her dangerous in ways no one recognized, because you can't easily control someone who already understands their worth, even when they choose to stay quiet, even when they choose to love deeply. And Naya did love deeply. That was never her weakness. It was her choice. She didn't enter her marriage blindly. She believed in it, invested in it, committed to it in ways that weren't performative. She supported Kyle without needing recognition. She adapted without losing herself. She stood beside him without trying to compete with him. And that balance, that quiet strength, was something he never fully understood, because to him, power had always looked different, and that difference would become the fault line everything eventually broke along. If you wanted to understand Naya fully, you had to understand where she came from, because her strength didn't come from isolation. It came from connection. Her upbringing was rooted in a rich Black cultural environment where identity wasn't something you searched for. It was something you were surrounded by every day. Her home wasn't quiet in the way Kyle's world was quiet. It was alive, voices overlapping in conversation, laughter that carried from one room to another, music playing in the background even when no one was actively listening. There was always something cooking, always someone visiting. Always a sense that you were part of something larger than yourself. And in that space, Naya learned presence. She learned how to read emotion before it was spoken, how to understand tone, energy, intention, how to recognize when someone needed support without them asking for it. But more than anything, she learned from her grandmother, a woman whose presence alone could quiet an entire room without raising her voice. Her grandmother didn't teach through lectures. She taught through observation, through carefully chosen words that stayed with you long after the conversation ended. She would say things like, "Pay attention to what people do when they think you're not watching." And Naya listened. She would say, "Love is not just what someone gives you when it's easy. It's what they protect when it's difficult." And Naya remembered. She would say, "Never confuse silence with weakness. Some people speak less because they already understand more." And Naya carried that with her. Those lessons didn't feel heavy at the time. They felt simple, practical, but over the years, they became the foundation of how Naya moved through the world. They shaped how she trusted, how she loved, how she responded when something felt off. So when her marriage began to shift, when the energy in her own home no longer matched what she had grown up understanding as real, those early lessons didn't disappear. They activated. She didn't panic. She didn't confront immediately. She watched, because that's what she had been taught. To observe first, to understand before reacting, to let people reveal themselves fully, instead of interrupting the process too early. And that's exactly what she did, even when it hurt. Even when the silence became heavy, even when every instinct told her something was wrong, she held her position, not out of fear, but out of discipline, because she understood something most people don't. The truth doesn't need to be forced. It reveals itself when you give it enough space. And Naya gave it all the space it needed. Kyle had never known a world where access was limited. From the moment he was born, doors opened, not because he pushed them, but because they were already unlocked for him. He grew up in environments where wealth wasn't discussed. It was assumed: private schools, exclusive networks, rooms filled with people who spoke the same language of status and expectation. In his world, success wasn't questioned, it was required. And, with that expectation came a specific kind of mindset. Everything had value, everything had ranking, everything had a place, people included. Relationships weren't just emotional connections. They were extensions of identity, reflections of status, indicators of success, and Kyle understood that early. He learned how to present confidence, how to speak with authority, how to control conversations in a way that made people trust him without questioning too deeply. To most people, he was impressive, sharp, focused, powerful, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately shifted the atmosphere. But beneath that surface, there was something far less stable, a quiet insecurity that didn't announce itself, didn't reveal itself directly. It hid behind perfection, behind control, behind the need to always appear certain, because for all his access, for all his advantages, there was one thing Kyle had never fully developed: internal security. His confidence depended on structure, on control, on maintaining an image that no one challenged, and the moment something disrupted that image, even slightly, that hidden insecurity began to surface, not in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts: a need to dominate conversations, a tendency to dismiss perspectives that didn't align with his own, a quiet discomfort when he wasn't the most informed person in the room. And with Naya, that discomfort existed from the beginning, even if he never admitted it, because Naya didn't fit into the categories he understood. She wasn't impressed by status. She didn't compete for attention. She didn't rely on him to define her place, and that unsettled him, not enough to push her away, but enough to create tension he didn't know how to process. So instead, he did what he had always done. He maintained control of the narrative, of the relationship, of how others perceived them, and for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. From the outside, Naya and Kyle looked like balance, a perfect pairing, elegance beside authority, composure beside confidence. But what people saw was only the surface, because, underneath, they were built from entirely different worlds. Naya came from connection, from community, from environments where people showed up for each other without needing a reason, where presence mattered more than performance, where conversations weren't about control, but about understanding, where love was expressed openly, felt deeply, shared without calculation. Kyle came from structure, from systems, from environments where everything had a purpose tied to outcome, where relationships were measured, where interactions carried weight beyond emotion, where status influenced value. And neither of these worlds were wrong, but they were different, and difference, when not understood, creates distance. At first, that difference felt like balance. Naya brought grounding into his life, a sense of calm that didn't rely on control. Kyle brought access, opportunity, a world Naya hadn't lived in, but could navigate with ease. They complemented each other until the differences stopped feeling like balance and started feeling like separation. Because where Naya valued presence, Kyle valued perception. Where Naya trusted intuition, Kyle trusted structure. Where Naya believed in depth, Kyle focused on appearance. And over time, those differences didn't disappear. They expanded, creating gaps neither of them addressed directly. Naya felt it first, not as conflict, but as distance, small at the beginning, almost unnoticeable, but consistent, until one day, it was no longer something she could ignore, and that's when her role shifted. She was no longer just loving him. She was studying him, quietly, carefully. because the same qualities that made her patient also made her precise. And while Kyle believed he understood the woman standing beside him, he had completely misread her, because Nia wasn't passive. She was present. She wasn't unaware. She was observant. And she wasn't powerless. She was simply waiting for the moment when everything would finally make sense. And when it did, she wouldn't need to fight for control, because she would already have it, long before the tension, before the silence, before the courtroom, and everything it would eventually expose. There was a night that felt almost effortless. A charity gala held in a glass-walled venue overlooking the city skyline. Everything about it was designed to impress, soft lighting reflecting off polished floors, voices layered over instrumental music, waiters moving with precision through carefully arranged conversations. It was the kind of environment Kyle had always moved through with ease, and the kind of space Nia entered without needing to prove she belonged. She wasn't there for attention. She wasn't there to network. She was there because the cause mattered. Education funding, programs designed to give under-resourced communities access to opportunities most people in that room had never had to fight for. Nia stood near one of the display panels, reading quietly, her focus fully on the work being presented, not the people watching her. That's what caught his attention. Not her appearance, not her presence, her focus. Kyle noticed how she didn't scan the room the way others did, didn't adjust her posture when someone important walked by, didn't shift her attention to follow influence. She remained exactly where she was, grounded, unmoved, and that was unfamiliar to him. So he approached, not with hesitation, not with arrogance, with precision. Most people don't actually read those, he said, stopping beside her. Nia didn't turn immediately. She finished the paragraph she was on, then calmly replied, "Most people don't fund what they don't understand." That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but definitive. Kyle wasn't used to responses that carried weight without effort. He wasn't used to being met with presence instead of performance. And for the first time that night, he wasn't controlling the conversation. He was participating in it. They spoke for 10 minutes, then 20, then longer than either of them had planned, about the program, about systemic gaps in opportunity, about leadership, responsibility, and what real impact looked like beyond public recognition. She didn't try to impress him. She didn't adjust her opinions to align with his. And he noticed that, by the time the evening ended, Kyle had met dozens of people, but Nia was the only one he remembered clearly. Not because she stood out in a traditional way, but because she didn't try to, and that made her impossible to ignore. Nia didn't fall quickly. That wasn't how she was built. Attraction wasn't enough for her. Neither was confidence. Neither was status. She paid attention to consistency, to behavior over time, to whether someone's actions aligned with what they said. And, in the beginning, Kyle met that standard. He followed up, not with empty messages, but with intention. Their conversations continued beyond that night. Structured, thoughtful, unforced. He asked questions that showed he remembered details, not surface-level things, but specifics. Her perspective on education reform, her thoughts on leadership, even small preferences she hadn't emphasized. That level of attention mattered to her, because it reflected effort, and effort was something Nia respected deeply. He didn't rush her, didn't pressure her, didn't try to move faster than she was comfortable with. Instead, he matched her pace, which made her lower her guard. Gradually, naturally, she began to see him as someone who wasn't just present, but intentional, someone who didn't just listen, but processed, and that distinction changed everything. Because for Nia, being understood mattered more than being admired, and Kyle made her feel understood, or at least, that's what it seemed. She found herself opening up in ways she usually didn't, sharing parts of her life she kept protected, her upbringing, her grandmother, her values, and every time she spoke, he listened, fully, without interruption, without redirecting the focus back to himself. That created trust, not instantly, but steadily, and over time, that trust turned into something deeper, something she didn't rush to define, but didn't resist either, because from everything she could see, he wasn't pretending, he was consistent, and consistency was what made her stay. Kyle didn't approach relationships casually. Everything he did had structure. That included how he pursued Naya. He paid attention to timing, to detail, to how moments were created, not in an overwhelming way, but in a way that felt deliberate. Their second meeting wasn't random. It was planned, a quiet restaurant, not crowded, not designed to impress, but designed to allow conversation. He remembered she preferred spaces where she could think clearly, where she didn't have to compete with noise, and that mattered, because it showed he wasn't just interested in being seen with her. He was interested in knowing her. He introduced her to parts of his world slowly, not all at once, not in a way that felt overwhelming. He explained things, contextualized spaces, made sure she never felt like she was stepping into something unfamiliar without support. At the same time, he adjusted himself, his tone, his pace, even his language, subtle changes, but intentional ones. He didn't interrupt her, didn't dismiss her ideas, didn't try to dominate conversations. Instead, he created space for her to speak, and when she did, he reinforced it, validated her perspective, expanded on her thoughts, built conversations instead of controlling them. To Naya, this wasn't just charm. It was alignment, because it matched what she had been taught. Respect, presence, attention. And Kyle delivered all of that. Consistently, he didn't rush physical closeness, didn't push boundaries, which made her trust him more, because restraint, to Naya, was a sign of control, and control, when used correctly, meant stability. From the outside, he appeared almost perfect, attentive, composed, reliable, the kind of man people would describe as rare, and, slowly, without forcing it, Naya allowed herself to believe that their relationship didn't explode into intensity. It built, layer by layer, moments that seemed small, but carried weight over time. Early mornings where conversations started before either of them fully woke. Evenings that stretched longer than expected because neither of them wanted to end them. He learned her rhythms, when she preferred silence, when she needed conversation, when she was thinking deeply and didn't want to be interrupted. And he adjusted accordingly. That made her feel seen, not in a surface way, but in a way that felt accurate. He noticed how she held tension in her shoulders when she was processing something, how she went quiet, not withdrawn, but focused, how her expression shifted when something mattered to her, and instead of questioning it, he respected it. That respect created space, and in that space, Naya softened, not by losing herself, but by allowing herself to relax, to exist without being on guard. They shared quiet moments that didn't need explanation, sitting side by side without speaking, but fully present, walking without rushing, talking without trying to impress. There was a calm between them that felt stable, and stability was something Naya didn't take lightly. He didn't try to change her, didn't try to redefine her. He accepted her as she was, or at least, that's how it felt, and that feeling became the foundation of everything that followed. Because when someone meets you with consistency, with attention, with care that feels intentional, you don't just notice it, you begin to trust it. And once trust is established, you stop preparing for what could go wrong. You start believing in what feels right. That's where Naya found herself, not distracted, not unaware, but open to something she believed was real, open to a man who, from everything she could see, was exactly who he presented himself to be. And for a time, he was. At first, nothing felt wrong. That's what made it difficult to detect, because the shift didn't arrive as a disruption. It didn't interrupt their routine in a way that demanded attention. It adjusted it. Gradually, Kyle started coming home later, not dramatically late, not in a way that could easily be questioned, just later than before. At first, it aligned with his schedule: business meetings, client dinners, Extended discussions that ran longer than expected. All reasonable. All consistent with the kind of life he lived. Naya didn't question it, because nothing about it felt forced. He still checked in, still sent messages, still maintained the structure of their communication. But something was different, not in what he said, but in how it felt. The timing became less predictable. Some nights, he would return at a consistent hour, other nights, much later, without clear explanation. And when he walked through the door, he carried a different energy. Not exhaustion, not stress, distance, subtle, controlled, but present. Conversations that used to flow naturally now required effort, not from Naya, from him. Shorter responses, less engagement, moments where his attention drifted, even while standing right in front of her. She noticed it immediately, not because she was looking for problems, but because change, no matter how small, stood out to her. And this wasn't random. It followed a pattern. 3 nights consistent, 1 night distant, then a return to normal, then a repeat. Structured inconsistency, the kind that doesn't raise immediate alarm, but creates a quiet sense that something isn't aligning. Naya didn't confront him. She didn't ask where he had been, didn't question the shifts. She watched, because from everything she had learned, patterns revealed more than explanations ever could, and this pattern was just beginning. The next shift wasn't in his schedule. It was in his habits. Kyle had never been careless with his phone, but he had never been guarded either. It existed in the open, on tables, beside him, within reach, not hidden, not protected, until it was. The change didn't happen overnight. It started with small adjustments, turning the screen slightly away when messages came in, lowering the brightness, responding more quickly, but with less visibility. Then came the habit of carrying it with him, everywhere, even into spaces where he hadn't before. Naya noticed the timing, messages arriving late at night. During those extended hours he claimed to be working, followed by shorter replies when she spoke to him directly. A shift in priority, not obvious, but measurable. And then, one night, something confirmed it. He was in the shower. His phone remained on the counter. It lit up. Naya didn't move immediately. She wasn't the type to search without reason. But this wasn't curiosity. It was confirmation. The screen displayed a name she didn't recognize. No context, no explanation, just a message. "Are you still coming tonight?" Short, direct, familiar. Naya didn't touch the phone. She didn't open the message, didn't scroll, didn't search for more. She simply looked, and then stepped away, because she didn't need more information in that moment. What she had seen was enough, not to conclude, but to confirm that something existed beyond what she had been told. And that was all she needed. When Kyle returned, nothing in her behavior changed. No questions, no tension, no indication that anything had shifted. But internally, everything had, because now, this wasn't a feeling, it was a direction. And Naya followed direction, not emotion. The next change didn't involve distance. It involved words. Kyle had always respected Naya's background. At least, that's how it appeared. He acknowledged her intelligence, her discipline, her perspective. But gradually, his tone shifted, not aggressively, not directly, subtly. Comments that didn't challenge her outright, but repositioned her. One evening, during a discussion about expansion strategies, he said, "You think about things differently, probably from your training." It sounded neutral, but the implication was clear. Different, not equal. Another time, during a conversation with colleagues, he introduced her not by her experience, but by her relationship to him. "My wife has a background in military work," he said casually. Not intelligence, not strategy. Military work. Simplified. Reduced. Naya didn't respond. She didn't correct him. She simply noted it. Then came the comparisons, subtle references to people in his network, how they approached business, how they structured decisions, always framed as observation, but positioned as standard. And slowly, without direct confrontation, her expertise began to be treated as secondary. not dismissed, but repositioned, and that shift mattered, because respect doesn't disappear loudly. It fades, quietly, through small adjustments in language, in acknowledgement, in presence. Naya recognized it immediately, not because she was sensitive, but because she understood hierarchy, and she knew exactly when she was being moved within it. Still, she didn't react. She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, didn't challenge him in those moments, because she wasn't trying to win a conversation. She was trying to understand a pattern. And now, the pattern was expanding. The tension didn't arrive as conflict. There was no raised voice, no direct confrontation, just a moment, simple, quiet, but definitive. They were sitting across from each other at dinner, a space that once felt easy, now, structured, measured. Kyle was speaking about an upcoming deal, detailing projections, timelines, expectations. Naya listened, then offered a perspective, not disagreement, not opposition, just insight, a consideration he hadn't mentioned. For a brief moment, he paused, and in that pause, something shifted, not in what he said, but in how he responded. "That's not really how this works," he replied, flat, not dismissive enough to be challenged, but not open enough to continue. Naya held his gaze, not confrontational, not defensive, present, waiting. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he moved on, redirected the conversation, and that was the moment, not because of what was said, but because of what was removed. Engagement, respect, openness, all replaced with control. Naya didn't respond. She didn't correct him, didn't push the conversation back. She allowed it to end, and in doing so, she learned something more important than any explanation he could have given. He no longer saw her as someone to build with. He saw her as someone to manage. That realization didn't break her. It clarified everything, because once you understand how someone sees you, you understand how they will treat you. And from that moment, Naya adjusted, not externally, internally. By now, the signs were clear, not obvious to anyone outside the relationship, not visible enough to raise concern from others, but undeniable to her. Late nights, guarded behavior, shifting language, controlled responses, each one small on its own, but together, forming something structured, intentional. And this is where most people make a mistake. They confront too early. They react based on emotion. They demand answers before understanding the full picture. Naya didn't do that. She didn't argue, and that's what saved her. Because reaction would have changed the dynamic. It would have alerted him, forced him to adjust faster, to hide more carefully, to control the situation more aggressively. Instead, she remained exactly as she had always been, calm, present, attentive. She continued conversations, maintained routine, allowed him to believe nothing had changed. But internally, everything had shifted. She stopped assuming, stopped interpreting his actions based on trust, and started analyzing them based on behavior. Every detail became data, timing, language, movement, patterns. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was building understanding, and understanding gave her control, because while he believed he was creating distance, she was gaining clarity. While he adjusted his behavior to protect something, she adjusted hers to observe everything. And that difference would determine everything that followed. Because in situations like this, power doesn't belong to the person hiding the truth. It belongs to the person who sees it clearly and waits. And Naya was no longer waiting to understand. She understood. Now, she was waiting for the right moment to act. The first time Naya noticed the car, she didn't act. The second time, she confirmed. By the third, it was no longer a coincidence. It appeared at the same hour, not exactly the same minute, but within a narrow window that suggested intention, always positioned across the street, never too close, never too far, a distance that allowed visibility. Without drawing attention, Naya adjusted her routine without making it obvious. She dimmed the lights earlier, shifted her position in the house, observed from different angles, not out of fear, out of strategy, because whoever was inside that vehicle was consistent, and consistency meant purpose. One night, she stood behind the curtain longer than usual, watching, waiting for movement, for confirmation that someone was there. Minutes passed, nothing. Then, a slight shift, not dramatic, but enough, a shadow adjusting, a presence repositioning. Someone was inside. Naya stepped back, not because she was uncertain, but because she had seen enough. This wasn't random observation. This was surveillance. And now, it was tied directly to everything else she had been noticing. The late nights, the guarded phone, the shifts in behavior, all of it. Connected, but she didn't confront, she didn't alert anyone. Because confrontation would expose awareness, and awareness would end the observation too early. So instead, she continued watching, and allowed whoever was in that car to believe they were the only one paying attention. Once Naya recognized the structure, everything else became clearer. Kyle's behavior wasn't random. It followed rhythm. Days where he was fully present, engaged, attentive, followed by periods of distance, short responses, delayed interactions. At first, those shifts seemed inconsistent. Now, they aligned. The nights the car appeared were the same nights Kyle stayed out longer. The messages that arrived late corresponded with those same windows of absence. And when he returned, his energy matched what Naya had already begun to track. Not exhaustion, adjustment, as if he was transitioning between two environments, one he controlled and one he needed to manage. Naya began mapping it mentally. Time, behavior, response patterns. She didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. Her mind held structure effortlessly. And the more she observed, the more precise the pattern became. There were triggers, certain days of the week, specific time frames, even changes in his tone, aligned with these shifts. And that's when she realized this wasn't emotional distance. This was operational, structured, planned. Kyle wasn't drifting. He was dividing, maintaining two separate realities, and managing them carefully, but not carefully enough, because the one thing he didn't account for was Naya's ability to remain still long enough to see everything clearly. And now, she wasn't just noticing behavior, she was understanding intent. The next shift didn't come through behavior, it came through numbers, small at first, barely noticeable. A transfer that didn't align with their usual structure, not large enough to raise immediate concern, not frequent enough to create alarm, but different. Naya wasn't directly involved in Kyle's financial operations. That had always been his domain. But she understood systems, and systems, when functioning correctly, maintain consistency. These didn't. She noticed it during a routine review. A document left open, a figure slightly out of place. At first, it could have been an error, but then it happened again and again. Different amounts, different dates, but similar structure. Funds moving in ways that weren't explained. Not illegal, at least not obviously, but concealed, positioned in a way that avoided attention. Naya didn't question him, didn't bring it up, because she already understood the pattern, and patterns didn't lie. She connected it with everything else. The late nights, the messages, the car, and now, money, which meant this wasn't just personal, it was strategic, something larger than a relationship. Something that required coordination. And once money becomes part of the structure, the situation changes completely, because financial movement always leaves traces, and traces, when followed correctly, lead somewhere. Naya didn't rush. She didn't investigate recklessly. She allowed the pattern to continue, because the longer it existed, the clearer it would become, and clarity was always more valuable than speed. At this point, everything looks connected, but nothing has been confirmed, and that's where it gets interesting, because now, It's not just about what Naya sees. It's about how you interpret it. So pause for a second. Look at everything we've uncovered so far. The car, the timing, the behavioral shifts, the hidden financial movement. Each piece on its own could be explained, but together, they form something much more deliberate. So here's the question. What do you think is really happening? Is this just secrecy within a relationship? Or is there something deeper? Something structured? Something that's been hidden far more carefully than it appears? Pause right here. What do you think is really going on? Comment below, because what you think now might change everything when the next piece is revealed. The first time Naya saw him, it wasn't across the street. It was much closer. Inside the vehicle Kyle had recently started using more frequently, a new driver, introduced without emphasis, without explanation beyond necessity. "This is Rowan," Kyle had said briefly. No background, no detail, just a name. Rowan nodded. Not overly formal, not overly relaxed, measured. Everything about him was controlled. His posture, his tone, even the way he made eye contact. Direct, but not invasive. Naya noticed immediately, because control recognizes control. He didn't speak unless necessary, didn't insert himself into conversations, didn't attempt to impress, but he was aware of everything, the environment, the tone between Naya and Kyle, the subtle shifts that most people would miss. Naya recognized it instantly, not consciously at first, but instinctively. This wasn't just a driver. This was someone trained to observe, someone who understood presence without needing attention. And that realization didn't alarm her. It aligned because, for the first time, she wasn't the only one in the room who saw beyond the surface. Kyle's reaction wasn't immediate, but it surfaced quickly. At first, it showed in small ways, correcting Rowan unnecessarily, giving instructions that didn't need clarification, establishing control, even when it wasn't challenged. Then, it became more visible, a shift in tone whenever Naya acknowledged Rowan, not openly hostile, but sharp, controlled, as if he was reasserting boundaries no one had crossed. One evening, as Rowan opened the door for Naya, Kyle spoke before she could respond. "That won't be necessary next time." Flat, unprompted. Rowan nodded, didn't react, didn't question, but Naya noticed, because the comment wasn't about the action. It was about presence. Kyle didn't like the balance, didn't like the shift in attention, didn't like that someone else in that space operated without his control. And that discomfort began to show, not loudly, but consistently, which made it impossible for Naya to ignore. Because for the first time, Kyle wasn't just managing her perception, he was reacting to someone else's presence. And that reaction revealed more than he intended. Trust didn't form instantly. Naya didn't operate that way. But recognition did, and recognition was the first step. Rowan didn't speak much, but when he did, it was precise, relevant, never unnecessary. He didn't overstep, didn't try to build familiarity, didn't attempt to create connection, which made his presence feel safe, not because he was friendly, but because he was consistent, and consistency was something Naya valued deeply. Over time, small interactions built understanding. A door opened at the right moment, a route adjusted without being asked, a subtle awareness of timing that aligned with her needs, not intrusive, supportive, and most importantly, respectful. He never assumed, never imposed. He allowed space, and in that space, Naya found something she hadn't felt in a while. Stability, not the kind built on control, but the kind built on awareness. And that distinction mattered, because, while Kyle's presence had become structured and distant, Rowan's presence was grounded and clear, and slowly, without forcing it, Naya began to trust that difference. It didn't start as attraction, it started as understanding. Moments of eye contact that lasted just long enough to acknowledge, not long enough to invite assumption, a shared awareness, nothing spoken, but clearly understood. Rowan never crossed boundaries, never allowed his presence to become inappropriate. But there was something in the way he looked at her. Not admiration, not curiosity, recognition, as if he saw exactly who she was, without needing explanation. And for Naya, that mattered more than anything else, because she had spent months being repositioned, quietly moved into a space where her voice carried less weight. But with Rowan, nothing needed to be proven. He didn't interrupt her, didn't correct her, didn't reduce her presence. He acknowledged it, naturally, without effort, and that created something unexpected. A sense of emotional safety, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, reliable. The kind that allows you to exist without calculation. Naya didn't act on it, didn't define it, but she recognized it, and recognition was enough. Because in contrast to everything that had been shifting in her life, this felt clear, uncomplicated, real, and while Kyle was focused on maintaining control, something else was forming quietly, not based on status, not based on perception, but based on something far more grounded, understanding, and that would change everything. Naya didn't go looking for answers, she followed patterns, and patterns always led somewhere. The financial irregularities she had noticed earlier didn't disappear. They became clearer, more frequent, more structured, not random movement. Directed, she adjusted her approach carefully, not by accessing anything directly tied to Kyle, but by observing the system around him, accounts connected to projects, subsidiary movements, timing between transfers. Each detail alone meant very little. Together, they formed structure. Money was being moved in layers, not in a way designed for speed, but in a way designed for concealment. Naya mapped the flow mentally, from origin, to redistribution, to final placement, and eventually, she found it, a holding structure, not tied directly to his name, not visible in his primary accounts, but connected through sequence, and that was enough. She didn't need full access. She needed confirmation, and now she had it. This wasn't careless behavior. This was deliberate separation. Resources being redirected away from what should have been shared. And once money is hidden, intent becomes undeniable. Naya didn't react, didn't confront him, didn't even let her expression change, because emotional reaction would give him time to adjust. Instead, she stored it. Every detail, every pattern. Because information only has power when used at the right moment, and she wasn't ready to use it yet. She was still building. The financial structure confirmed one thing. Kyle wasn't just hiding money, he was maintaining something separate. A second life. Not in the dramatic sense most people imagine. Not chaotic, not unstable, controlled, organized, structured the same way he managed everything else. Naya began aligning the timelines. His late nights, the car, the hidden transactions. They didn't overlap randomly. They aligned, precisely. Specific days, specific hours. And once she focused on those windows, everything became clearer. Locations began to repeat. Not publicly, not in ways easily traced, but consistent enough to identify. He wasn't moving without purpose. He was going somewhere, regularly, and that meant someone else was involved, not a possibility, a certainty. Naya didn't rush to identify who. She focused on structure first, because understanding the system always came before identifying the players, and once she understood the system, the rest followed naturally. Kyle had created separation, not just emotionally, operationally, a life that existed parallel to their marriage. Carefully managed so neither side disrupted the other, but separation always leaves traces, and those traces had led her here. Now, she wasn't questioning whether something was wrong, she was defining exactly what it was, and how far it extended. Naya didn't search for her, she found her through pattern, through timing, through alignment. The same name that had appeared on the phone now appeared again, connected to one of the locations Kyle frequented, not directly, but consistently enough to confirm presence. Lena. Naya didn't attach emotion to the name. She didn't create assumptions. She observed. Over time, details formed. Lena wasn't random. She existed within the same structured environment Kyle operated in, connected, positioned, not an accident, not a mistake, an extension, someone who understood his world, someone who fit into the life he was building outside of Naya. That realization could have triggered reaction, anger, confrontation, but Naya didn't move, because this wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about clarity, and clarity required distance. She gathered enough to understand the role Lena played, not everything, but enough. Enough to confirm presence, enough to confirm consistency, enough to confirm intention. Kyle wasn't divided. He was deliberate, maintaining two realities with precision, and Lena was part of that structure, not hidden by accident, but positioned carefully. Naya didn't confront her, didn't approach her, didn't disrupt the structure, because disrupting it would collapse the visibility she had built, and she wasn't finished observing. Not yet. This was the moment everything could have broken, where most people would react, where anger would take control, where confrontation would feel necessary. Naya did none of that. She didn't explode. She became still, not the kind of stillness that comes from shock, the kind that comes from decision, because now everything made sense. The distance, the control, the secrecy, all of it had structure, and structure could be studied, used, reversed. Naya didn't see herself as a victim. She saw herself as informed, and that changed everything. Because once emotion is removed, clarity takes its place, and clarity creates options. She didn't confront Kyle, didn't reveal what she knew, didn't challenge the situation prematurely. Instead, she allowed everything to continue, exactly as it had been, because the longer it continued, the more complete the picture would become, and when she acted, it wouldn't be reactive. It would be precise, calculated, final. She adjusted her behavior slightly, not enough to be noticed, but enough to create space. Internally, she had already stepped out of the relationship. Externally, nothing had changed, and that contrast became her advantage. Because Kyle believed he was in control, he believed his structure was intact, he believed she was unaware, and as long as he believed that, he would continue, without caution, without adjustment, without realizing that every step he took was being documented, not on paper, but in understanding, and that understanding was becoming complete. The conversation didn't start with tension, it started with calm. Kyle sat across from Naya, composed, prepared. The documents were already on the table, organized, structured, exactly how he preferred everything to be. He didn't hesitate. "This is the best way forward," he said. Direct, controlled, no emotion in his tone, no attempt to soften the moment, as if the decision had already been made. Long before this conversation, Naya looked at the papers, didn't rush, didn't react. She read carefully, every clause, every condition, not because she needed to understand them, but because she wanted him to believe she did. The terms were clear: separation, division, control maintained in his favor, structured in a way that assumed compliance. Kyle watched her closely, expecting something: confusion, resistance, emotion. He got none of it. Naya turned the final page, placed the document back on the table, and simply said, "Okay." No hesitation, no question, no challenge. And in that moment, something shifted, not visibly, but internally, because that wasn't the response he had prepared for. Still, he didn't question it, because to him, agreement meant control, and control meant victory. From that point forward, everything moved according to Kyle's expectations. At least, that's what he believed. Naya didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't push back on any of the terms presented. She followed the process, signed where necessary, attended meetings without resistance, maintained composure in every interaction. To Kyle. This confirmed everything he already assumed, that she didn't fully understand what was happening, that she lacked the leverage to challenge him, that the outcome was already decided. And that belief made him comfortable, too comfortable, because when someone believes they've already won, they stop being careful. They stop watching for variables. They stop considering the possibility that something might not be what it appears to be. Naya allowed that belief to grow. She reinforced it. Through calm responses, through silence where conflict was expected, through cooperation that appeared genuine. But underneath that surface, everything was in motion. Every detail she had gathered, every pattern she had confirmed, every piece of information she had stored, it wasn't forgotten. It was being positioned. For a moment, a single moment, where everything would align, and when that moment arrived, control wouldn't shift gradually. It would change instantly. Back in the courtroom, at 8:17 a.m., as Kyle watched her walk in, that's what he felt. Not fear, not yet, but something unfamiliar, a break in certainty, because, for the first time, something wasn't following his structure, and he didn't know why, but Naya did, because everything he believed was under control was about to be taken from him. The courtroom had already shifted the moment Naya walked in, but no one understood why, not the judge, not the attorneys, and especially not Kyle. He still believed this was procedural, structured, predictable, until Naya spoke. "Before we proceed," she said calmly, her voice steady, "there are additional materials that need to be reviewed. Not emotional, not confrontational, precise." A folder was placed on the table, not thick, not overwhelming, but organized. Every document positioned with intention. The judge nodded, gave permission. Naya didn't rush. She opened the folder slowly and began. "Timeline first," she said. "A sequence of dates, not random, aligned, late nights, unexplained absences, locations that repeated with consistency, each one supported by records, not assumptions, not statements, proof." Kyle's posture shifted slightly, barely noticeable, but real. Naya continued. "Communication patterns," she added. "Logs, timestamps, connections between movements and messages." Still, she wasn't looking at him. She was speaking to the room, to the structure, because this wasn't about confrontation. This was about clarity. Each piece built on the last, no gaps, no emotion interrupting the flow. And, as the pattern became visible, the room changed, not dramatically, but undeniably, because what was being presented wasn't speculation. It was alignment, a system, and systems, once revealed, cannot be denied. Kyle leaned forward slightly, not reacting, but recalculating, trying to understand how much she knew, trying to identify where the gap had occurred. But Naya didn't pause, because she already knew he wouldn't find it. He had underestimated the one variable he never accounted for, her patience, and now, that patience was speaking. The shift from behavior to finance was where everything changed, because patterns could be explained, but numbers could not. Naya turned to the next section of documents. "Financial movement," she stated, still calm, still controlled, no accusation in her tone, just presentation. The first page displayed transfers, small, individually insignificant, but grouped together, they formed something else entirely. A pattern of redirection, funds moving through layered accounts, not illegal on the surface, but concealed, deliberately. Naya didn't explain everything at once. She allowed each piece to settle, to be understood before moving forward. "This is the originating account," she said, pointing briefly. "Then, here is the secondary structure. Then, final placement, each step connected, each movement traceable, and most importantly, each one linked back to Kyle, not directly, but undeniably." That distinction mattered, because it proved intent, not accident, not mismanagement. Design. Kyle's composure began to tighten, still controlled, but no longer comfortable, because this was no longer within the boundaries he had set. Naya continued. Total amount redirected, she said, sliding the final document forward. The number wasn't spoken immediately. It didn't need to be. It was visible, clear, impossible to dismiss, and that was the moment. The room fully understood. This wasn't a standard separation. This wasn't a disagreement. This was exposure. Complete, structured, final. Kyle's control didn't disappear instantly, but it fractured, because control depends on certainty, and certainty was no longer his, just when it seemed complete. The door opened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with perfect timing. Every head in the courtroom turned. Naya didn't, because she already knew. Lena stepped inside, composed, not confused, but not fully aware of what she was walking into. She had been called, presented with information that required her presence, but not the full truth. Not yet. She moved forward slowly. Her eyes scanned the room, until they landed on Kyle, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. Recognition, then uncertainty, because his expression was not what she expected. Naya finally turned, not to confront, but to acknowledge. This is Lena, she said calmly. No emotion, no hostility, just fact. The room shifted again, because now, the structure had a face, not just numbers, not just patterns, a person, and that changed the weight of everything. Kyle's jaw tightened. This, he hadn't planned for, not her presence, not here, not now, but Naya remained steady, because this moment was never accidental. It was placed exactly where it needed to be. Naya didn't raise her voice, didn't escalate. She simply shifted direction. Lena, she said, her tone unchanged. You were told certain things about this situation. Lena didn't respond immediately. She looked at Kyle, waiting, expecting him to speak. He didn't, and that silence said more than anything else. Naya continued. You were told this marriage was already over. A pause, not for effect, but for clarity. You were told the separation was mutual. Lena's expression changed, subtly, but unmistakably, because those words were familiar. Naya stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. You were also told, she continued, that there were no shared financial obligations that would affect you. That was the moment. Not loud, not explosive, but definitive, because now, the truth wasn't just being revealed to the courtroom, it was being revealed to Lena. In real time, her gaze shifted again, back to Kyle, searching, waiting for denial, for correction, for anything that would restore the version of reality she had been given. He said nothing, and that silence collapsed everything, because betrayal doesn't only exist in one direction, it expands, and in that moment, Lena understood. She wasn't separate from the lie. She was part of it, used, positioned, just like everything else. Naya didn't need to say more. The realization was already happening, visible, unavoidable, and that was the impact, not noise, clarity. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It breaks in stages. First, uncertainty, then exposure, then loss. Kyle had already reached the second stage. Now, the third began. His structure, the one he had built carefully, was no longer intact. The financial system, exposed. The second life, revealed. The people involved, present. Nothing left hidden, nothing left controlled. He attempted to speak, to regain direction, but for the first time, his words didn't carry weight, because the room no longer responded to him. It responded to the evidence, and the evidence was complete. Naya didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about defeating him emotionally. It was about removing the structure he depended on, and once structure is gone, control has nowhere to exist. The judge spoke, procedural, measured, but definitive. Next steps were outlined, consequences acknowledged, and through it all, Kyle remained still, not composed, not in control, Just still, because there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to adjust, nothing left to hold on to. Naya stood where she had been from the beginning, unshaken, not victorious in expression, but complete, because this was never about revenge. It was about truth, and truth, when revealed with precision, doesn't need force. It stands on its own. As she turned to leave, she didn't look back, not at Kyle, not at Lena, because everything that needed to be said had already been proven, and for the first time since this began, she wasn't observing, she was done. The courtroom didn't echo after Naya walked out. It settled, quietly, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had already been decided. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, clearer, for the first time in months. There was no pattern to track, no behavior to analyze, no tension to interpret, just space. Naya stood still for a moment, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, present, because endings like this don't arrive with noise, they arrive with clarity. The legal process continued in the background. Signatures finalized, assets reassigned, structures dismantled, but Naya didn't focus on the mechanics, because the real separation had already happened, long before the courtroom, when she chose to stop reacting and started understanding. Kyle's world didn't collapse overnight. It shifted. Controlled spaces replaced with monitored ones. Decisions no longer his alone. Consequences moved into place, not dramatically, but permanently. And that permanence was something he couldn't negotiate. Naya didn't follow his outcome. She didn't revisit it, didn't seek updates, didn't need closure from him, because closure had already been achieved, not through explanation, through exposure. And once truth is seen clearly, there's nothing left to question. She stepped forward, not away from something, but toward something else, and that direction was entirely her own. Healing didn't begin with relief. It began with stillness, not forced, not structured, allowed. Naya didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't distract herself, didn't replace one routine with another. She sat with it, every moment, not reliving what happened, but understanding what it meant, because healing, for her, wasn't about forgetting. It was about clarity. She revisited her own decisions, not with regret, but with awareness, where she had trusted, where she had adapted, where she had remained silent, not to judge herself, but to understand her own patterns. And through that process, something shifted. She didn't feel broken. She felt informed, stronger, not because she endured something difficult, but because she learned from it without losing herself. There were moments, quiet ones, where the weight of it all surfaced, not pain, but recognition of how much she had carried without reacting, of how much she had seen without speaking. And in those moments, she didn't suppress it. She acknowledged it, then let it pass, because she no longer needed to hold on to it. Healing wasn't a process she chased, it was something she allowed, and over time, that space inside her, once filled with questions, became steady again, not empty, grounded. Naya didn't return to where she started. She returned to what shaped her, the environment that built her sense of self. Before anything else tried to redefine it, her grandmother's home hadn't changed. Same warmth, same presence, the kind of place where time moved differently, not slower, but more intentionally. When Naya walked in, there were no questions, no interrogation, just recognition. Her grandmother looked at her, not surprised, not concerned, understanding. "You see things clearly now," she said, not as a question, as a statement. Naya nodded, because there was nothing to explain. They sat together, not discussing what had happened, but sharing space. Meals prepared the same way they always had been, conversations that moved between memory and meaning. And in that environment, Naya reconnected with something deeper than circumstance. Identity, not defined by relationship, not influenced by loss, but rooted, steady, unchanged at its core. Her grandmother didn't offer advice. She didn't need to, because everything Naya needed had already been given to her long ago. The discipline, the awareness, the understanding of when to act and when to wait. And now, Naya carried those lessons differently, not as preparation, but as confirmation that she had always been capable. She just needed the moment to prove it. And now, she had. Rowan didn't appear suddenly. He didn't step into her life with declarations. He remained exactly as he had always been, consistent. After everything was over, he didn't push for conversation, didn't assume closeness, didn't try to define anything. He respected distance, and that meant more than words. Their first interaction after the courtroom was simple, a quiet check-in. "Are you all right?" he asked, not pressing, not expecting a specific answer, just present. Naya met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no complexity behind it. "No," she said honestly. Then, after a pause, "But I will be." Rowan nodded. No reassurance, no attempt to fix it, just acknowledgement. And that created something deeper than comfort, trust. Over time, their interactions remained steady, conversations that didn't need to be extended, silence that didn't need to be filled, no pressure, no performance, just presence. Rowan never tried to replace what had been lost. He didn't position himself as the solution. He simply remained reliable, and that reliability allowed something new to form, not rushed, not forced, built on understanding. Instead of assumption, their connection wasn't based on intensity. It was based on recognition. He saw her clearly, not as someone who needed to be managed, not as someone to be impressed, but as someone to be respected. And Nia didn't have to adjust herself to receive that. She simply existed. And that was enough. Some people enter your life and teach you how to question yourself. Others teach you how to trust what you already know. Naya had experienced both, and now she understood the difference. Because real connection doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't require you to adjust your voice, to reduce your presence, to second-guess your instincts. It meets you where you are and recognizes you without condition. That's the kind of love that lasts, not because it demands, but because it sees. Love that sees you, not uses you. If this story touched you, like and share. Someone out there needs to hear this. There's a difference between love and losing yourself in the process of trying to keep it. One builds you, the other slowly removes parts of you, until you no longer recognize who you are. Naya didn't lose herself, even in silence. She remained aware, and that's the truth most people miss. Silence doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it means observation, preparation, strength held in control, until the right moment arrives. Because real strength isn't loud. It doesn't rush. It doesn't react without understanding. It chooses, and when it does, it doesn't look back. Remember this: love is not the sacrifice of self. Silence is not the absence of awareness. Strength is choosing yourself, even when it changes everything. Subscribe to Mr. Heartstring Tales for more stories that hit deep.